Wednesday, 3rd of July, 1940, Mers-el-Kébir, Algeria. The sea boils with the sinking of ships. The sky is choked black with palls of thick smoke. A large swathe of the French Navy has been wiped out after a tense standoff and hours of back-and-forth negotiations. But this was not between sworn enemies, as the date of the tragedy would infer. No, this was the doing of a long-term friend. A most shameful act perpetrated by a country's navy that was supposedly allied to France. But was the attack justified? Or was it an overzealous knee-jerk reaction by the beleaguered and scared Brits? Today, Descent into Darkness looks at one of the most controversial acts of the whole Second World War. Operation Catapult. The attack on Mers-el-Kébir. Background. Following the fall of France to the Nazi jackboot on the 10th of May 1940, the French government and military were faced with the humiliation of having to seek favourable terms with their conqueror. This resulted in the division of the country. The north and all of the west coast were held by the Nazis, known as Occupied France, and the south being controlled by a new government based at Vichy. This would be known as Vichy France, and would be a puppet government of Germany under Philippe Pétain, a way to control the entirety of France without having to station an even greater number of troops there. At least with the north occupied, the Nazis could shift their focus onto the last remaining bastion of resistance, Great Britain, which was now all alone in the conflict. One thing became starkly clear. If the Nazis demanded that France hand over her navy, at a stroke, she would be able to go toe-to-toe with the British. And if the Italians could be convinced to sail alongside the Kriegsmarine, they would be on a par with each other. One thing that large navies like Britain and the USA really hate, and that's a fair fight. Why fight fairly and risk losing when you can overwhelm the enemy and win easily? The French did have an aircraft carrier called the Béarn, but this was safely tucked away in the Caribbean, and so was well out of reach. But the battle group currently anchored in North Africa, well, that was far easier to get to. The overall commander of the French forces at Mers-el-Kébir was Vice-Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul, who had previously headed the Force de Raid, based at Brest. Pause for childish laughter. This squadron was a fairly powerful and highly mobile force that had protected French interests in the Mediterranean Sea. Gensoul answered directly to the High Admiral of the former French government, François Darlan. Darlan had been trusted by the British, but as the armistice with Germany was fleshed out, he had begun to shift more toward the political side, and had begun issuing various inconsistent statements as to the position of the French fleet under the terms of said armistice, changing his stance no less than 4 times in only 2 weeks. Thus, the British had lost all faith in Darlan's word. This was compounded when the British had gotten hold of a copy of the armistice agreement and read Article 8, which stated, "The French war fleet, with the exception of the part which is left at the disposal of the French government for the safeguarding of French interests in its colonial empire, will be gathered in port to be determined, and will have to be demobilized and disarmed under the control of Germany or Italy respectively. The designation of these ports will be made according to the home ports of ships in peacetime. The German government solemnly declares to the French government that it does not intend to use during the war for its own purposes the French war fleet stationed in the German-controlled ports, except the units necessary for the surveillance of coasts and mine dredging. Hitler formally and solemnly declares that he does not intend to make any demands on the French fleet during the conclusion of the peace, with the exception of the part of the French war fleet to be determined that will be earmarked for the safeguarding of French interests in the colonial empire. All war units outside of French territorial waters will have to be recalled to France." Of course, the British had bitter experience of Hitler's so-called promises, and so were inclined to believe that he had every intention of using the French fleet for his own ends, or if not, hand them over to Italy for the same reason. This article also went directly against the assurances that Admiral Darlan had given the British, given that he would have known exactly what the terms of the armistice entailed and had voted for it as part of the new Vichy cabinet, having previously even gone as far as to declare that he would rather mutiny and order the fleet to sail for British ports to continue the war. His position had softened as the days and weeks dragged on. This is what ultimately led to concluding that Darlan was simply a liar. Darlan had, however, sent orders to the bulk of the French fleet anchored in Toulon that they were to scuttle themselves if it was looking likely that they would fall into foreign hands. Now that the Marine Nationale was scattered to avoid falling into the hands of the Kriegsmarine, the Royal Navy was very keen to ensure that this could never be a possibility. Of particular interest to the British and German and Italian navies were the two modern battleships Richelieu and the incomplete Jean Bart, and the two battlecruisers Dunkirk and Strasbourg. If these four vessels fell into the hands of the Germans, they alone could have formed a very strong battle group. This issue would be compounded to the nth degree if they were also to join up with the German or indeed Italian heavy units. That potential force could be a very deadly match for the Royal Navy, and there was no way in hell the Brits could allow that to happen. Thus, Operation Catapult was formed. Its mission, if they won't join us, destroy them. Of course, it was a little more nuanced than that, but we shall get into those finer details later. However, unbeknownst to either the French or the British, Hitler himself had vetoed the idea of seizing the French fleet for fear of driving the French sailors over to the British side. The best thing, he thought, was to leave them be and allow the Vichy government to order them to remain where it was for the duration of the war. This was a rare example of Hitler actually taking a very wise decision. The Kriegsmarine were already heavily outnumbered by the British Navy, and to add the French in as well would almost guarantee that no German naval operations could ever have hoped to achieve anything. The French fleet at Mers-el-Kébir consisted of the old battleships Bretagne and Provence, and the seaplane tender Commandant Teste, the battlecruisers Dunkirk and Strasbourg, and 6 destroyers, or in the French naval parlance, contraversial, of the Le Fantasque and Mogador classes. These included Mogador, Volta, Tigre, Lynx, Kersant, and Le Terrible. The British fleet was made up of the battlecruiser Hood, the battleships Valiant and Resolution, and the carrier Ark Royal, along with an escort of 2 cruisers, the Arethusa and Enterprise, and the destroyers Falkner, Foxhound, Forester, Keppel, Active, and Violette. With overall command of the operation delegated to Admiral Somerville, who had initially protested the idea of potentially having to attack his erstwhile ally. He was officially reprimanded for taking this stance and told that his orders were clear and that he was to carry them out to the letter. Negotiations. In the early morning of the 3rd of July 1940, the destroyer Foxhound arrived off Mers-el-Kébir and dropped anchor. Initially, a message was sent to the French command by radio. To Monsieur l'Amiral Gensoul, the British Admiralty has sent Captain Holland to confer with you. The British Navy hopes that their proposals will enable you and the valiant and glorious French Navy to be by our side. In these circumstances, your ships would remain yours, and no one need have anxiety for the future. A British fleet is at sea off Oran, Mers-el-Kébir, waiting to welcome you. Captain Holland of the carrier Ark Royal had been sent aboard HMS Foxhound by Admiral Somerville. He decided to send Holland in his stead because Somerville spoke no French, whilst Holland spoke it fluently, and he thought it would be a waste of time having to wait for translations to be exchanged. Sadly, this was where the first major hiccup of the negotiations occurred, as Gensoul, in true arrogant Frenchy style, balked at the idea of having to negotiate with a mere captain, well beneath his rank. He refused to even see Holland. Holland, left with little choice, opted to present written terms to be passed on to the French commander by his flag lieutenant just before Holland was recalled to HMS Foxhound to exit the harbour. Foxhound left, but Holland remained behind aboard Foxhound's motor launch. Meanwhile, the British forces noted that the French ships appeared to be raising steam. Perhaps they were filled with the apprehension that just maybe the French had taken the smart decision to join them. Eventually, the flag lieutenant handed over Holland's note to the admiral at around 9:30 that morning. The British had given a 4-point ultimatum, which read, "To Monsieur l'Admiral Gensoul, His Majesty's government have commanded me to inform you as follows. They agreed to the French government approaching the German government only on conditions that if an armistice was concluded, the French fleet should be sent to British ports. The Council of Ministers declared on the 18th of June that before capitulating on land, the French fleet would either join the British forces or sink itself. Whilst the present French government may consider that terms of their armistice with Germany and Italy are reconcilable with these undertakings, HM government finds it impossible from their previous experience to believe that Germany and Italy will not at any moment that suits them seize the French warships and use them against Britain and her allies. Italian armistice prescribes that French ships should return to metropolitan ports, and under armistice, France is required to yield up units for coast defense and minesweeping. It is impossible for us, your comrades up until now, to allow your fine ships to fall into the power of German or Italian enemy. We are determined to fight on until the end, and if we win, as we think we shall never forget that France was our ally, that our interests are the same as hers, and that our common enemy is Germany. Should we conquer, we solemnly declare we shall restore the greatness and territory of France. For this purpose, we must be sure that the best ships of the French navy will not also be used against us by the common foe. In these circumstances, HM government have instructed me to demand the French fleet now at Mers-el-Kébir and Oran shall act in accordance with one of these following alternatives. A. Sail with us and continue to fight for victory against the Germans and Italians. B. Sail with us with reduced crews under our control to British ports. The reduced crews will be repatriated at the earliest moment. If either of these courses is adopted by you, we will restore your ships to France at the conclusion of the war, or pay full compensation if it is damaged meanwhile. C. Alternatively, if you feel bound to stipulate that your ships should not be used against German or Italians, since this would break the armistice, then sail them with us with reduced crews to some French port in the West Indies, Martinique, for instance, where they can be demilitarized to our satisfaction, or perhaps entrusted to the United States of America, and remain safely until the end of the war, the crews being repatriated. If you refuse these offers, I must with profound regret require that you sink your ships within 6 hours. Finally, failing the above, I have the orders of His Majesty's government to use whatever force may be necessary to prevent your ships falling into German or Italian hands. A while later, the flag lieutenant returned to Captain Holland with a reply from Admiral Gensoul that read, very abruptly, to Admiral Somerville. The assurances given by Admiral Gensoul to Vice Admiral Sir Dudley North remain the same, in which no French warships will fall intact into the hands of either the Germans or Italians. 2. In view of the substance and form of this downright ultimatum which has been sent to Admiral Gensoul, the French ships will be defended by force. Captain Holland returned to Foxhound to send on Gensoul's reply to Somerville. This was then relayed back to the Admiralty and onwards to Downing Street. In the meantime, the main British fleet had now arrived. Upon reading Admiral Gensoul's curt reply, Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent a signal back to Somerville. You are charged with one of the most disagreeable and difficult tasks that the British Admiral has ever been faced with, but we have complete confidence in you and rely on you to carry it out relentlessly. With this in mind, Admiral Somerville tried his very best to reiterate the best intentions of the British to his opposite number. He ordered a signal sent via Morse lamp. It read, To Monsieur l'Admiral Gensoul from Admiral Somerville. We hope most sincerely that the proposals will be acceptable, and we shall have you by our side. At 11:09, another handwritten note was passed to Captain Holland aboard Foxhound's launch. It read, 1. Admiral Jean Soult can only confirm the reply already sent via Lieutenant de Vaisseau Dufay. 2. Admiral Jean Soult is prepared to defend himself by every means at his disposal. 3. Admiral Jean Soult draws Admiral Somerville's attention to the fact that the first shot fired at us will result in immediately ranging the whole French fleet against Great Britain, a result which would be diametrically opposed to that sought by HM government. A tense few hours now passed with neither side hearing from the other, and so Somerville decided to press the issue with another signal informing Jean Soult that the French fleet would not be permitted to exit the harbour without one of the proposed options being agreed upon. He further communicated the news that the French ships currently moored in Alexandria had just agreed to disarm themselves. He received no reply to these messages, and so he resolved to open fire at around 1300. Which was then put back to 1500 when he saw that none of the French ships were attempting to cast off their moorings. He decided on another plea for sanity via Morse lamp for the French to raise a flag if they accepted one of the British terms. As a precaution, he ordered Ark Royal to launch aircraft to lay mines at the mouth of the harbour. At this point, Jean Soult relented from his intransigence and signalled that he would accept another face-to-face meet, and so, once again, Captain Holland re-entered the harbour, arriving aboard Dunkirk at around 1615. But of course, once again Jean Soult's pride would not allow him to be threatened by a mere captain, feeling even more like this was a personal slight that Somerville would not come himself. The French commander did at least talk to Holland this time, but it quickly degenerated into an argument, with Jean Soult declaring that he did not take kindly to threats, and that he would only take his orders from Admiral Darlan. He then produced a cipher from his commander-in-chief sent the previous week that amounted to standing orders in the event of imminent seizure or capture by the enemy. One of these instructions stated that the French ships could sail to the USA, an option which had been put to them in the ultimatum, as Captain Holland pointed out. However, Jean Soult disagreed with this interpretation, stating that it only applied to the Germans or Italians threatening them, not the British. A highly dubious and pedantic splitting of hairs, I feel. Jean Soult had been trying to get hold of Admiral Darlan back in Vichy, but he was home on leave, and so could not be contacted. And in any case, the previous message had stated that these were his final instructions. However, in a disgraceful omission on Jean Soult's part, he only told Vichy that the choice the British gave to him had been either to join them or scuttle. Given the Pétain regime was only armed with less than half of the information, the reply came back from the puppet government that Jean Soult should under no circumstances surrender his vessels and that he should meet force with force. The British already knew this, as they were reading the French signals and relaying them in real time to Somerville once translated. Finally, at 1720, Jean Soult sent his final message to Somerville. 1. The French fleet cannot do otherwise than apply the clauses of the armistice on account of the consequences which will be borne by metropolitan France. 2. Formal orders have been received, and those orders have been sent to all commanding officers so that if, after the armistice, there is a risk of the ships falling into enemy hands, they would be taken to the USA or scuttled. 3. These orders will be carried out. 4. Since yesterday, 2nd of July, the ships now at Oran and Mers-el-Kébir have begun their demobilization, reduction of crews. Men belonging to North Africa have been disembarked. Dejected and frustrated at having reached an impasse with the French commander, at 1725, Captain Holland returned to Foxhound. Given that the French had begun raising steam, the British believed that the French vessels had not been demobilized at all, and so they felt now they were left with little option than to take the most drastic of action. The attack on Mers-el-Kébir. With a heavy heart and with the weight of the world on his shoulders, a little after 1730, Admiral Somerville ordered the call to action stations, and the big guns of the British heavy units swung out. Then, after what must have seemed like an eternity, at 1754, the huge 15-inch guns of Hood roared and coughed their deadly venom at the battleship Bretagne. Given the calm conditions and stationary target, the gunners had zero problems finding the range. The French ships were a much outdated design. Even the two battle cruisers were not designed to stand up to 15-inch shells of the British vessels. In only 3 salvos, shells slammed through the hull plating of the Bretagne and detonated one of her main magazines, quickly putting her out of action in a thunderous pall of smoke and shrapnel, along with the lives of 977 of her crew. Pity then that, less than a year later, Hood's gunnery would not prove so deadly efficient against the Bismarck. The French vessels attempted to return fire, but it was ineffective, and fires began to quickly spread. The battlecruiser Strasbourg slipped her moorings and managed to avoid the shelling, the magnetic mines that the British Swordfish aircraft had laid across the mouth of the port, and an attempted airstrike from Ark Royal to make it out into open sea. Hood did, however, attempt to pursue, but in doing so, her tired old machinery became her Achilles' heel as she stripped a turbine, causing her to abandon the pursuit. And, as Hood was the only British unit capable of matching the Strasbourg for speed, the plucky Frenchie got away to fight another day, escaping back to Vichy, France, and the port of Toulon, something that could most certainly not be said for unfortunate sister. After around only 10 minutes of shelling, the British ceased fire as the replies from the French ships had dwindled to naught. The action had been short, but deadly effective. Aftermath. In all, the attack on Mers-el-Kébir claimed the lives of 1,297 French sailors, most of whom being taken by the sinking of the Bretagne. A further 2 deaths occurred on the British side due to a skewer from Ark Royal being shot down. However, the next day, the British intercepted radio transmissions claiming that Dunkirk was still relatively undamaged and still seaworthy, and so Ark Royal launched a squadron of planes to attack the battlecruiser, and succeeded in blowing up a small ship that was moored alongside directly next to her that was loaded with depth charges. This cargo had gone off and blown a huge hole in the side of the Dunkirk, which then quickly settled on the bottom of the harbour. A little ways away from Mers-el-Kébir, the carrier HMS Hermes launched an attack on the modern battleship Richelieu, which was moored up in Dakar, which caused minimal damage. Richelieu would then come under further attack in September from Free French forces before the battleship was surrendered to them, albeit in need of repair. Jacqueuse. Of course, we must address the highly tricky and troublesome subject of whom is to blame for the events of Mers-el-Kébir on that awful day. The main suspects, of course, are Admiral Somerville and Admiral Jean Soult. Certainly, Somerville was the man who ultimately took the decision to begin the attack. It must have been one hell of a dilemma, but his orders were clear. He had no choice in the matter. If the French would not acquiesce to the British terms, the only option left was to destroy them. But in doing so, he risked not only failing to sufficiently damage the French vessels, but more poignantly, France would have been well within their rights to declare war on Britain and join the Nazis' planned invasion of the British Home Isles. Thankfully, neither of these happened, save for the escape of the Strasbourg. I think that Admiral Somerville should have taken the effort to meet Jean Soult personally, even if it meant the awkward waiting whilst translations occurred. Far better that Jean Soult's ego were massaged rather than what actually happened. This, I feel, was Somerville's greatest missed opportunity. It was obvious that Jean Soult wanted to be addressed by a man of equal rank, as per the unwritten rules of gentlemanly conduct. It is highly likely that the whole sorry affair could have been avoided in exchange for a bit of extra time and personal effort on the part of the British commander. And then we have Admiral Jean Soult. He certainly did not help the classic French stereotype of arrogance when it came to the negotiations. His refusal to meet with Holland, as he felt he was of lesser rank and therefore perceived some kind of slight on his authority, was nothing more than sheer bloody ignorance on his part. But when one is faced with such an ultimatum, it is easy to understand why he would not only bristle at such an imposition, but want to seek further clarification from his superiors. The fact that he did not communicate the entirety of the British terms is a huge mistake on his part. Whether this was deliberate or not remains to be seen. But, as commander of the French fleet, he ultimately had the lives of the men under his command in his hands. His truculence and indignance led to the breakdown in communications that left his opposite number feeling that he had little choice but to attack. I will leave it up to you, dear viewers, in the comments to decide who is ultimately to blame. I can see both sides being lacking in some areas of their negotiation skills and rash decision-making. It's just a shame that it had to cost 1,299 lives because of it, and that is a price paid in blood by brave men doing their duty. Legacy. The attack on Mers-el-Kébir is a dark stain on Britain's illustrious history, one of many, sadly. But this one ranks as one of the most egregious. The French were, and still are, our allies, and we violated that sacred bond of La Belle Alliance out of fear and desperation. Yes, it can be argued that they were left with little choice given the situation, but nevertheless, the risk of the French turning on us would have made Britain's position even more precarious than it was. Luckily, whilst Anglo-French relations did take a severe hit, they were not broken, and we would continue to resist the common enemy hand in hand until final victory was achieved in 1945. But when all is said and done, and regardless of any other issue, the fact is that the attack on Mers-el-Kébir was entirely avoidable, and every single step should have been taken to ensure that it did not go down the way it did. Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, give the old like button a good old rub, and subscribe to DID and ding the bell to be notified whenever I put out new content. Check out my back catalogue to find even more great stories from the dark side of history. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon or become a channel member to support the work I do. Or if you wish to give a one-off donation, you can do so via the Super Thanks button. Or if you want some merch, check out my store and rep the channel that you love so well. Thank you to every and all of my current supporters and those who buy the merch. You really are helping me keep the lights on at my little dark castle. Don't forget to check out my second channel, DID Reads, for more great narrated content, and sometime in the near future I will be launching DID Sings, just because I can. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.